Can you believe that a 51-year-old woman working as a nurse could take down a hired hitman with a $50,000 bounty with her bare hands? Can you believe that a husband who once vowed to live and die together could hire someone to kill his own wife just because he couldn't accept divorce? On the evening of September 6, 2006, in Portland, Oregon, a 14-minute life-and-death battle unfolded in a bedroom. The result? The hunter became the prey. This is the story of Susan Kuhnhausen, the woman who turned the killer into the victim. Welcome to the Case Files, where we explore shocking cases, unsolved mysteries, and true crime stories that make you reflect on the dark nature and light within humanity. Today, we're diving deep into one of the most incredible cases of justifiable self-defense in American legal history, a story of ruthless betrayal, survival instinct, and the amazing power of the will to live when humans stand at the threshold between life and death. In this episode, we're taking a deep dive into the infamous case of When Prey Becomes Predator, the Susan Kuhnhausen case, the story of a woman who killed the hitman hired by her husband to assassinate her, and the journey to find justice in a world full of betrayal. The beginning of a marriage when love blinds us to warning signs. The story begins in 1988, when Susan Kuhnhausen, a dedicated and compassionate nurse in Portland, Oregon, met and fell in love with Michael Kuhnhausen. For Susan at the time, this wasn't just love, but the perfect choice for her life. Michael appeared as an ideal man, a military veteran with a masculine appearance who seemed caring and attentive to her. Their marriage in the early years was truly like a modern fairy tale. They bought a charming little house in Portland worth $300,000, a significant investment for the young couple. Susan, with her natural caregiving nature as a nurse, always gave her husband the very best. She cooked delicious meals, took care of Michael when he was sick, listened to his concerns, and shared his work difficulties. For nearly 2 decades initially, their life went smoothly. Michael worked at an adult video store called Fantasy Adult Video as a cleaning supervisor, a job that wasn't prestigious, but was stable. Susan continued dedicating herself to nursing at Providence Portland Medical Center, where she had worked for over 30 years, rising from a nursing intern to becoming a respected emergency room specialist. But why would a seemingly stable marriage lead to a bloody tragedy? The first cracks, when military past leaves its mark. As time passed, the first cracks began appearing in their seemingly perfect marriage. Michael, the husband Susan once loved wholeheartedly, began showing concerning changes. He became irritable and bothered by small things. The patience and gentleness of before gave way to sudden bursts of anger and harsh words. Susan, with her deep understanding of human psychology from her profession, believed these changes were related to Michael's military past. She knew that many veterans faced post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, and difficulties adjusting to civilian life. With boundless love and patience, Susan decided to accompany her husband through this difficult period. She began researching psychological support programs for veterans. She spent time studying, contacting specialists, and convincing Michael to attend therapy sessions. She enrolled her husband in support groups where he could share with people in similar situations. Susan believed that with love and persistence, she could help Michael find himself again. But would love be strong enough to change a person who had already begun falling? The irreversible decline, when love is no longer enough. However, all of Susan's efforts seemed like drops of water falling on a desert. Michael's condition not only didn't improve, but became worse. His angry outbursts became more frequent and violent. He began drinking more, coming home late without clear explanations. Arguments between the couple intensified, from small daily matters to major issues about their future. Michael became suspicious and controlling. He regularly checked Susan's phone, questioned her about male colleagues at the hospital, and showed displeasure when she had to work night shifts. Trust and mutual respect, the fundamental foundations of marriage, had begun to crumble. The once warm home now became cold and tense. Their dinners together turned into suffocating periods of silence. Susan often had to go to work feeling heavy-hearted, and work at the hospital became where she found temporary peace. Susan's friends and colleagues began noticing changes in her. The woman who was once cheerful and full of energy now frequently appeared tired and worried. When asked, Susan would just shake her head and say, "Everything will be fine." The painful decision. When safety matters more than love. Finally, after 18 long years of enduring and trying to save their marriage, Susan reached a decision she never thought she'd have to make: separation and preparing for divorce proceedings. This decision didn't come from impatience or selfishness, but from realizing that this marriage was no longer safe for her. In 2005, Susan officially informed Michael of her decision to separate. She explained that they needed time to think about their marriage, and perhaps living apart would help both of them. Michael moved out to live separately, but still kept house keys and occasionally returned to get personal belongings. For Michael, Susan's decision was no different from a death sentence. He couldn't accept that their 18-year marriage would end like this. In his mind, Susan was his property. And no one had the right to take that away from him. Stubbornness turned into obsession, and that obsession would soon become a sinister plan. But how far would Michael go to keep Susan? Conspiracy in the shadows. When love turns to hatred. During their separation, Michael began nurturing a dark plan in his mind. He thought that if Susan died, he would inherit the house worth $300,000 and all remaining assets. He also believed Susan had life insurance, and as her husband, since they hadn't officially divorced, he would be the beneficiary. At his workplace, the adult video store Fantasy Adult Video, Michael met Edward Haffey, a 59-year-old man working part-time cleaning. Haffey was someone with a dark criminal past. He had served 20 years for conspiracy to commit murder, had records for robbery, theft, and many drug-related crimes. Most recently, he had just completed a 9-year sentence for killing his ex-girlfriend. Michael and Haffey knew each other through a psychological support program for veterans, one of the programs Susan had researched and encouraged Michael to join. It was ironic that the place Susan hoped would help her husband become better became where he found his accomplice. Haffey was a heavy cocaine addict and was always in need of money to buy drugs. When Michael proposed a special job to him, he listened with interest. Michael didn't speak directly about killing, but cleverly called it an insurance scam, a phrase criminals often use to hide the true nature of their actions. Deal with the devil. $50,000 for a life. After weeks of probing and negotiation, Michael and Edward Haffey reached a sinister agreement: $50,000 to end Susan Kuhnhausen's life. This was an enormous sum for Haffey, more than he could earn in many years of cleaning work. According to later testimony from a witness named Harold Jones, a few days before the incident, Jones drove Haffey to Applebee's restaurant to meet Michael. On the way, Haffey bragged to Jones about soon receiving $50,000 from a husband who wants to kill his wife. Jones initially thought these were just the boastful words of a drug addict, so he paid no attention. Michael had planned the assassination in detail. He provided Haffey with house keys and the alarm system code. He showed Haffey the house layout, clearly indicating where the bedroom was and what time Susan usually came home. He also discussed the method. It had to look like a robbery gone wrong, with no traces left behind. To create an alibi, Michael planned to go to a seaside inn on the day of the action. He would check in, create evidence of not being in Portland, then secretly return to the city to let Haffey into the house. But neither of them expected that Susan Kuhnhausen was not an easy victim. The fateful day, September 6, 2006, when the perfect plan meets an unexpected opponent. Wednesday, September 6, 2006, Portland's sky was as blue as any other day. Susan Kuhnhausen, now 51, finished her shift at the emergency department of Providence Portland Medical Center. After 30 years as a nurse, with the last 15 years working in the stressful emergency environment, Susan was accustomed to dealing with difficult and dangerous situations. Instead of going straight home as usual, Susan decided to stop by a hair salon to trim her hair, preparing for a vacation she was planning. While waiting, she called Michael. A few days earlier, she had asked him to watch her cat and house while she was away. Although they were separated, Susan still trusted Michael with such matters. But Michael didn't answer. She called a few more times but still got no response. Susan felt slightly annoyed, but thought maybe he was busy or his phone battery was dead. With her new hairdo and a fairly relaxed mood, Susan drove back to her small house on Southeast Portland. This neighborhood was quite quiet, with charming wooden houses built in the 1940s, 1950s. Susan loved this house, where she and Michael had decorated together, planted flowers in the garden, and created beautiful memories during their happy early years. When she parked and walked up to the porch, she had no idea that just a few meters away, Edward Haffey was hiding in the shadows, watching her every move. Ominous signs. When instinct warns of danger. Susan unlocked the front door and entered the house. Immediately, a strange feeling enveloped her. The house was too quiet, a different silence from other times she came home late. It wasn't the normal quietness of an empty house, but a tense silence, as if someone was holding their breath somewhere in the darkness. On the kitchen counter, next to the microwave, she discovered a neatly placed piece of paper. Michael's familiar handwriting. "Sue, I couldn't sleep. I have to go to the beach to clear my head." Michael entering the house without permission made Susan extremely angry. They had agreed that even though he still kept keys, he had to notify her before wanting to enter the house. But anger quickly gave way to a deeper feeling of unease. Susan began observing her surroundings more carefully. There were too many unusual things. Every day before work, she always had the habit of opening all window curtains to let sunlight into the house. But now, all the curtains were drawn closed in an unusual way, making the house sink into an eerily gray atmosphere. The main bedroom door, which she usually left slightly open for air circulation, was also tightly closed. Even the bathroom door was shut tight, something she had never done. Something very wrong was happening in her own house. The instinct of an emergency room nurse with 30 years of experience dealing with dangerous situations was screaming warnings. Susan felt her heart beating faster, her palms beginning to sweat coldly. She knew she needed to be extremely careful. The horrifying moment. When death jumps out from behind the door. With growing anxiety, Susan slowly moved toward the hallway leading to the bedroom. Each of her steps was cautious, every sense stretched to its limit. She could hear her heart beating in the suffocating silence of the house. When she reached the bedroom door, she paused for a moment, listening. There was soft breathing coming from inside, a sound she was sure wasn't caused by wind or outside noise. Her hand trembled as she grasped the cold metal door handle. With a deep breath, Susan pushed the door open. At that very moment, like a monster jumping out of the worst nightmare, a huge figure lunged from behind the door. Edward Dalton Haffey, about 5'9", tall, with disheveled hair and beard reaching his chest, wearing a black baseball cap pulled down to cover his eyes, hands wearing yellow rubber gloves, and in his right hand gleamed a heavy claw hammer. His eyes blazed with madness and hatred. He looked at Susan with a terrifying smile, like a hunter who had trapped his long-pursued prey. Without a word, he swung the hammer high, aiming straight at the head of the small-framed woman standing frozen before him. Susan Kuhnhausen's fight for her life officially began. 14 minutes of life and death, when survival instinct awakens. The devastating blow from the hammer made Susan Kuhnhausen completely lose her balance. Intense pain spread from her left temple, blood flowing out, soaking her freshly done hair. The world around her spun, swayed, and she fell hard onto the wooden floor. For a few seconds, her consciousness seemed erased, but through the hazy veil of shock and pain, a more fierce flame had ignited in her heart, the flame of the will to live. She couldn't die here, couldn't fall in the very house she had considered the safest place on earth. "Who are you? What do you want in my house?" Susan screamed, her voice strained from pain but still full of defiance. Edward Haffey didn't respond. The terrifying smile remained on his ugly face, as if killing her was just an amusing game. He continued swinging the hammer, determined to complete the job Michael had paid him $50,000 in advance. 4. In that moment, hanging by a thread, the mind of the emergency room nurse with 30 years of experience suddenly became extraordinarily sharp. The years of facing critical situations in the emergency room, times of restraining aggressive patients under the influence of drugs or alcohol, and the judo self-defense lessons she had taken flashed like a fast-forwarded film in her head. Susan knew that if she wanted to survive, she had to fight with all her strength and intelligence. Fierce resistance, when experience becomes a weapon. Susan began a fierce and calculated resistance. She clawed and bit at Haffey's arms and hands with all her force, but this wasn't just instinctive action, but a carefully calculated strategy. With her knowledge of forensics and criminal investigation, she knew she needed to leave as much of the attacker's DNA on herself as possible. If she couldn't survive, at least the police would have crucial clues to track down the killer. She bit hard into Haffey's arm, leaving deep, gaping teeth marks. She clawed her nails into his face and neck, hoping to get skin and blood samples under her nails. These actions surprised and angered Haffey. He hadn't expected his victim to resist so fiercely. During the struggle, Susan realized an important advantage. Although Haffey was about 3 inches taller than her, she was nearly 45 pounds heavier than him. With her full figure and good health from years of working in the stressful medical environment, Susan decided to use her body weight as a weapon. She gathered all her strength, launching straight at Haffey like a wrecking ball. The powerful impact made him stagger, lose balance, and had to lean against the wall to avoid falling. The fateful words. "You're pretty strong." Through gritted teeth, while trying to regain his balance, Edward Haffey let out a statement he never expected would become Susan's greatest motivation. "You're pretty strong." These words, instead of frightening Susan, acted like a powerful stimulant, giving her more confidence and strength. It confirmed that she wasn't a weak, helpless victim. She could resist. She could defeat her enemy. With determination boiling like a volcano, Susan prepared for her second attack. This time, she poured into it all her anger toward the person who had violated her home, all the accumulated fear, and most importantly, all her desire to live and continue her life. The second charge was decisively effective. The attacker completely lost his balance and fell flat on the hard wooden floor. The sound of impact echoed in the small room. The claw hammer, the deadly weapon, flew from his hand and slid far across the floor. Turning the tables. When prey becomes predator. Quick as lightning, Susan grabbed the hammer. The feeling of cold, heavy metal in her hand seemed to give her more strength. Now, the balance of power had completely changed. The hunter's weapon was now in the prey's hands. The roles of killer and victim had dramatically reversed. Susan didn't give Haffey a second to recover or counterattack. She stood up, cornered him against the wall, and began swinging the hammer in reverse attack. Each of her strikes was precise, powerful, and full of determination. Caught off guard and hit repeatedly, the professional killer who had once murdered his ex-girlfriend collapsed, unconscious. Thinking the battle was over and she had won, Susan put down the hammer, breathing heavily. Her whole body ached from wounds, clothes torn to shreds and covered in blood, hers and the attackers. She rushed out of the house, shouting loudly for help from neighbors. But the nightmare wasn't really over yet. The final round, when the nightmare returns. Just as Susan turned back to check the situation, a hand, cold as ice, grabbed her ankle tightly. Edward Haffey had regained consciousness. His eyes now looked even more insane and hateful than before. Blood flowing from the head wound made his face look like a monster from hell. The second struggle was even more brutal and decisive than the first. Two people rolled around on the floor, among glass shards from the mirror, broken decorative items scattered everywhere. The sounds of impact, heavy breathing, and painful groans echoed in the cramped space. Susan remembered the judo lessons she had taken in self-defense programs for medical staff. In this life-and-death moment, that knowledge became a life-saving weapon. With a skilled movement, she turned, used her body weight to pin down Edward Haffey, and quickly executed a chokehold, a technique that blocks the carotid artery, preventing blood flow to the brain. The final question in desperation. The killer writhed in desperation beneath her like a fish out of water. His breathing became intermittent and wheezing. His face changed from red to purple, then gradually blue. Even in this life-and-death situation, Susan maintained the rationality and humanity of someone in the healing profession. "Tell me, who sent you here?" she screamed, leaning forward to tighten her grip. "Tell me, and I'll let go and call an ambulance for you right now." But her only answer was meaningless growls and moans. Edward Haffey couldn't or wouldn't respond. Perhaps he knew that if he revealed Michael's name, he himself would face danger from other criminals in the network. Susan understood she was standing at the crossroads of life and death. This was no longer a question of right or wrong, but a question of who would survive. Either her, an innocent woman who just wanted to live peacefully, or him, a hitman paid to take her life. With a final decision, cold but resolute, Susan leaned her entire body weight forward, using all her life's strength to tighten her left arm. The muscles on her arm tensioned like violin strings, blood vessels bulging clearly. Edward Haffey's struggling gradually weakened, bit by bit, then stopped completely. His body went limp like a rag doll. Edward Dalton Haffey, 59 years old, the killer who had murdered his girlfriend and was paid $50,000 to kill Susan, died at the hands of the very victim he intended to assassinate. The moment of silence after the storm. In the deathly silence of the small bedroom, Susan Kuhnhausen slowly stood up. Her legs trembled, not just from exhaustion, but from the terrible psychological shock. Her blood and the attacker's blood mixed together on the wooden floor, creating frightening dark red streaks. She stood looking down at Edward Haffey's motionless body. This was the first time in her life that she, a person who had devoted her entire life to healing and protecting life, had to take another human being's life with her own hands. Feelings of guilt and shock hit her like a tsunami. But she also felt deep relief. She was still alive. She had won. The nightmare was truly over. With still trembling hands, she picked up the claw hammer, the weapon Edward Haffey intended to use to end her life, and ran out of the house. Her screams for help in the darkness awakened the sleeping neighbors. Police arrival. The beginning of the search for truth. Within 15 minutes, the sirens of ambulances and police cars echoed through the quiet neighborhood of Southeast Portland. Shocked neighbors stood on their porches, unable to believe what they were witnessing. Susan Kuhnhausen, the gentle woman who always greeted everyone friendly every day, now stood before her house, looking disheveled, bloody, and wounded all over. When police and medical personnel arrived at the scene, they faced a scene like from a horror movie. The once charming small bedroom now in ruins, furniture broken and scattered everywhere, blood pooled in various spots on the floor, and a corpse lying motionless in the midst of chaos. Susan was immediately taken to the hospital for examination and wound treatment. Doctors found she had suffered quite severe head trauma from the hammer blow, many deep scratches on her arms and shoulders, but fortunately no life-threatening injuries. Most importantly, her mental state remained very alert and resilient. Through initial investigation at the scene, the attacker was identified as Edward Dalton Haffey, 59 years old, a person with a dark criminal past. He had served 20 years for conspiracy to commit murder, most recently 9 years for killing his ex-girlfriend, having just been released from prison in 2003. Forensic examination showed extremely high cocaine levels in his blood and urine, proving he had used drugs just before carrying out the attack. Initial hypothesis: failed robbery. With this initial information, investigators quickly arrived at the simplest and most believable hypothesis. This was a failed burglary and robbery. Edward Haffey, under heavy drug influence, had broken into Susan's house to search for valuables or cash. Unfortunately, he was discovered by the homeowner while working, leading to the deadly fight. Susan's actions were considered completely justified, self-defense when attacked in her own home. This hypothesis seemed reasonable and easy to accept. Most investigators agreed that the case was clear and needed no further investigation. The file would be closed with the conclusion: Edward Haffey died while committing robbery. Susan Kuhnhausen acted in justifiable self-defense. But for Susan, this hypothesis had too many holes and illogical points. The victim's logical arguments. With remarkable composure and sharp logical thinking of someone working in the medical environment, Susan presented to police the illogical points in the initial hypothesis. She didn't accept this simple explanation and was determined to find the truth. First and most importantly, no valuables in the house were stolen or even disturbed. TV, computer, jewelry, cash. Everything remained intact in its proper place. If Haffey was a thief, why didn't he take things that were easy to sell and valuable? Why didn't he search for anything at all? Second, he had deliberately drawn all the window curtains in the house, tightly closed the bedroom door, and waited for her to return. This was clearly the action of someone lying in ambush with intent, not a burglar caught by chance or surprise. A normal thief would try to grab items and escape as quickly as possible, not sit waiting for the homeowner to return. Third, and most important, the house's alarm system. Susan explained that she had installed a modern and very sensitive security system. Anyone breaking in by forcing locks, smashing windows, or even opening doors without knowing the password would certainly trigger the alarm and automatically alert the security company. This system would only remain silent when someone used the correct key and entered the correct password to disable it. This meant there was someone close who knew about the security system and had keys, who had opened the door for Edward Haffey to enter the house. And that person could only be Michael Kuhnhausen. Oh, irrefutable evidence. Susan's logical and rigorous arguments convinced the investigators. They began viewing the case from a completely different angle and conducted deeper investigation in this direction. The report from ADT Security Company confirmed exactly what Susan said. The alarm system was disabled at 2:47 p.m. on September 6th, and the person who did this was Michael Kuhnhausen. He had used his key and password to turn off the system, then left the house at 3:15 p.m. The note, I couldn't sleep. I have to go to the beach to clear my head. That Susan found on the table suddenly became highly suspicious. Was this a pre-prepared alibi? The decisive discovery. The mysterious backpack. While cleaning and examining the scene more thoroughly, Susan discovered a strange black backpack forgotten in a dark corner of the basement. This backpack clearly didn't belong to her, and police hadn't noticed it in their initial inspection. When opened, inside the backpack were Edward Haffey's personal items: some old clothes, diabetes insulin, a bottle of Hershey's chocolate syrup, a strange combination for a killer, and most importantly, 2 crucial pieces of evidence that became the key to solving the case. The first piece of evidence was a used pay stub with Edward Haffey's name, issued by Fantasy Adult Video, the very company where Michael Kuhnhausen worked as cleaning supervisor. The second piece of evidence was even more important. In a small, worn brown notebook, there was a page with scrawled notes in blue ballpoint pen. Call Mike, 94, along with a phone number. When police checked, this phone number was exactly Michael Kuhnhausen's personal cell phone number. The connection between Michael and Edward Haffey had become clear and undeniable. They weren't just co-workers at the same workplace, but also had direct contact with each other. The mysterious veil covering the case was finally lifted, revealing the cruel truth beneath. The hunt for Michael Kuhnhausen. Portland police immediately issued an arrest warrant for Michael Kuhnhausen, but he seemed to have vanished from Portland. The Seaside Inn address he had registered at was just a cover. He had left there since the afternoon of September 6th, and no one knew where he had gone. The manhunt lasted a tense week. During this time, Susan lived in constant fear. She knew Michael was likely hiding somewhere and planning to kidnap or attack her again. She didn't dare stay alone and always had to have protection. On September 13th, exactly 1 week after the attack, police finally found Michael Kuhnhausen at a small hotel only about 10 miles from Providence Portland Medical Center, where Susan worked. He had shaved his head, grown a beard, and tried to change his appearance, but still couldn't escape. When arrested, Michael seemed to have mentally prepared for this. He showed no surprise or resistance, but silently went with the police. Confession and the cruel truth. Faced with irrefutable evidence and police interrogation pressure, Michael Kuhnhausen finally had to bow his head and confess. His testimony revealed a plan even more cruel and calculated than anyone had imagined. Main motive: Michael couldn't accept divorcing Susan. In his sick mind, Susan was his property, and no one had the right to take that away from him. When Susan was determined to divorce, he planned to kill his wife to seize all assets, including the house worth $300,000, savings accounts, and life insurance money he believed he would receive. Planning process. Michael had spent months preparing. He learned about Edward Haffey through the Psychological Support Program for Veterans, a program Susan herself had encouraged him to join to improve his mental condition. It was ironic that the place Susan hoped would help her husband become better became where he found his accomplice. He knew Haffey was a heavy drug addict, always needing money and willing to do anything to get drugs. He approached Haffey skillfully, not speaking directly about killing, but calling it a special job or insurance scam. The cruel deal. After weeks of negotiation, Michael and Haffey reached an agreement of $50,000 to solve Michael's problem. This was an enormous sum for Haffey, many times what he could earn in an entire year. Michael provided Haffey with house blueprints, keys, alarm passwords, Susan's daily schedule, and even the method of execution. He demanded it be made to look like a robbery gone wrong, with no traces connecting to him. The alibi plan and ruthless calculations. To create the perfect alibi, Michael had planned extremely detailed steps. On September 6th, he drove to Oceanside, a seaside town about 2 hours from Portland, and checked into a small inn. He deliberately appeared before the receptionist, chatted about needing rest due to marital stress, even bought some food at a nearby convenience store to create as many witnesses as possible. Hahowever, right after checking in, he secretly drove back to Portland. He arrived home around 2:30 p.m., turned off the alarm system, let Haffey in, gave detailed instructions about the bedroom location and Susan's usual homecoming routine, then quickly returned to Oceanside before anyone could discover. Michael's plan was even more cruel than that. He had bought a .38 pistol and written a suicide note with touching content. "All I ever wanted was to be loved, and every time I get it, I screw it up. I can't live in a world without Sue." Initially, he planned to kill himself after Susan was murdered, creating a tragic play about a husband too grief-stricken by his wife's sudden death, making everyone believe both were victims of a brutal robbery. But at the last moment, greed and desire for the assets won out. He decided he wouldn't die, but would live to become the only surviving, grieving husband, inherit everything, and start a new life built on his wife's death. He never imagined that the wife he dismissed as small and weak had such amazing hidden strength and will to live. Trial and Justice. On August 30th, 2007, at Multnomah County Court, Michael Kuhnhausen officially pleaded guilty to charges of conspiracy to commit murder and solicitation of murder. The trial attracted attention from the entire Portland community and national media. Susan Kuhnhausen, now officially renamed Susan Walters, to completely shed any connection to her traitorous husband, stood before the court and read an hour-long statement. She held photos of her wounded face after the attack, turned toward Michael, and said, "You told police you knew I was okay. Look at me. Do I look okay to you?" Her voice trembled, but was full of strength and determination. "You used a desperate person to do the desperate thing you were too cowardly to do yourself. If I ever believed you deserved to die, at least I would have had the courage to kill you myself." Michael Kuhnhausen was sentenced to 10 years in prison, a sentence many felt was too light for the brutal crime he had committed. However, this was the maximum sentence Oregon law allowed for conspiracy to commit murder when the victim wasn't killed. 4 years of living in fear. But for Susan, the 10-year prison sentence wasn't the end of her nightmare. She knew that the day Michael was released would be the day she faced the risk of revenge. Someone who had once hired a hitman to kill his wife certainly wouldn't stop there. To protect herself, Susan sued Michael for $1 million in damages. This wasn't for revenge or greed, but a smart defensive strategy. She wanted to ensure that when he got out of prison, Michael wouldn't have a penny to hire any other hitman. The following years, Susan lived in constant vigilance. She moved to a new house in a different area of Portland, installed state-of-the-art security systems with cameras, motion sensors, and direct connection to security companies. She bought a handgun and spent many hours at the shooting range, learning to use it proficiently. She regularly checked Michael's release schedule, calculating how much longer until he would be free. Fear of that day was like a haunting ghost, always present in every sleep, every waking moment. Unexpected liberation by fate. But life sometimes has arrangements full of irony and surprise. On June 13, 2014, at Snake River Correctional Institution in Oregon, Michael Kuhnhausen died of terminal lung cancer, exactly 92 days before his scheduled release. When receiving this news, Susan felt a deep relief she had never experienced before. The greatest threat in her life, the person who had wanted to take her life, had permanently disappeared. She no longer had to live in fear. Rising from ashes, a warrior's new life. Michael's death freed Susan from the nightmare that had lasted nearly a decade. She officially completed legal procedures to change her name from Susan Kuhnhausen to Susan Walters, completely shedding the surname of the person who had heartlessly pushed her toward death. In December 2014, after more than 35 years of dedication to nursing, Susan Walters decided to retire from Providence Portland Medical Center. Colleagues and patients all regretted losing an experienced and compassionate nurse. But Susan Walters didn't choose a reclusive life or self-pity. Instead, she decided to turn personal tragedy into motivation to help others in similar situations. New mission: from victim to protector. In 2017, Susan Walters began close collaboration with the Multnomah County District Attorney's Office to create Case Companion, a free website specifically supporting crime victims. This website provides information about the justice system, guides legal procedures, and allows victims to easily track their case progress. She also actively participated in women's strength and girl strength programs by Portland Police, self-defense programs for women and girls. With her painful real-life experience, she became a convincing instructor, teaching students not just self-defense skills, but also resilient spirit and will to live. She traveled everywhere, from schools to seminars, telling her story, not to seek sympathy or pity, but to spread a powerful message about the hidden strength in every person and the importance of trusting one's instincts. Recognition and honor. In 2008, Portland Police awarded Susan Walters the Civilian Medal of Heroism, a rare honor reserved only for individuals with exceptionally brave actions. At the award ceremony, the police chief praised her pure determination and peaceful, calm, and confident demeanor throughout the harsh ordeal. Susan's story has also been made into many TV programs, documentaries, and publications. She has appeared on famous shows like I Survived, Investigation Discovery, and many others, always with a positive message about human resilience. The Susan Kuhnhausen case is not just a story about justifiable self-defense or a special criminal case. This is living proof of the amazing power of the human spirit when facing the most severe challenges. A 51-year-old woman with 2 bad knees and no professional combat training defeated a hitman paid $50,000 using only will to live, intelligence, and determination. More importantly, this story is also a warning about dangerous signs in toxic relationships. Susan spent 18 years trying to save her marriage, believing love could change everything. But sometimes, leaving a toxic relationship is the most correct and courageous decision. Susan once shared, "The worst thing about this whole ordeal wasn't that someone tried to kill me, but that I had to kill someone to survive. I'm not ashamed of what I did, but I'm not proud of it either. I didn't choose death for him. I chose life. I chose my life." Today, at age 70, Susan Walters remains an unyielding warrior. She continues dedicating the rest of her life to ensuring no one else has to go through what she experienced. Through her work supporting crime victims, she has touched and changed thousands of lives. Valuable lessons from Susan's story. Always trust your instincts. When Susan felt something wasn't right in her house, she didn't ignore that feeling. You're stronger than you think. In decisive moments, humans can overcome any limits they thought impossible. Never underestimate the power of the will to live. When life is threatened, survival instinct can turn an ordinary person into an invincible warrior. Know when to walk away. Sometimes, ending a toxic relationship isn't failure, but courage. Turn pain into strength. Instead of letting tragedy define her life, Susan chose to use it as motivation to help others. Thank you for joining us on the Case Files today. Susan Kuhnhausen's story reminds us that within every person lies great strength, and sometimes we need to face the most severe challenges to discover it. If this story inspires you or if you know someone in a difficult situation, please share it with them. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you won't miss our other intriguing cases and inspiring stories. See you in the next episode, where we'll continue exploring other unsolved mysteries and amazing stories from the world of crime. Stay safe, stay strong, and remember, you're stronger than you think. Stronger than you think.